Hello and welcome to Frank Philosophy, where we speak frankly about philosophy. I'm your host, Frank, a philosopher. I have a BA, an MPhil, and a PhD in philosophy, and I teach philosophy at a university far, far away. And today we'll be looking at a text called Autumn Floods, which is a chapter from the Zhuangzi anthology, which is a collection of Daoist writings from the Warring States period of China. Now, this is the first of our, and definitely won't be the last, video that I'll do on Chinese philosophy. My PhD is in Chinese philosophy. My area of specialty is Chinese philosophy, so I hope to do more and more. But for reasons that may become apparent, it's a bit trickier to find texts that I can really do justice to in a video like this, because the cultural background, the historical background, the philosophical background, and the textual issues, just the nature of the writing itself in Chinese is it just makes things a little trickier. But anyway, I hope to do more of it, and this is our first one, and it's a text that I love. It's a lot of fun. The Zhuangzi, the anthology itself, is a lot of fun, and I think that Book 17, Autumn Floods, is a really good introduction to the thoughts of the Zhuangzi overall. Okay, but before we get into that, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's supporting the channel in these very early days. I have this sort of crazy idea for a style of philosophy content that I don't see on YouTube, and I'm hoping that people find it interesting, whether they're students looking to looking for help on readings that they get assigned, or looking for something to help you fall asleep, or just something to throw on in the background. I'm hoping that these streams are engaging, or not streams, sorry, these videos are engaging and informative enough that you enjoy them and share them with your friends and leave a comment, like and subscribe and all that stuff. So we'll see how this experiment goes, but for now I'm just going to keep going. And we'll get better and better every day. I finally got my audio fixed. I think the things sound better in my previous two videos. So hopefully we'll just keep going and keep getting better and better in terms of the content. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get to the philosophy. So as I said, the Zhuangzi is a Daoist text. You might be familiar with the term Daoism, spelled Tao-ism, Taoism. That's just an older fashioned style of Romanizing the Chinese, but now in the modern spelling, it's usually spelled with a D, Daoism, but it's the same thing. And the Zhuangzi is one of the classic texts of Daoism, the other one being the Tao Te Ching, or the Lao Tzu. And this one, well, they both have pretty messy histories in terms of how we ended up with the text. But the Zhuangzi is, well, it's associated with a guy named Zhuangzi, and there's a bit more historical credibility to the idea that this guy actually lived. A guy named Zhuangzhou was actually alive during, the late 3rd century BC, or sorry, the late 4th century BC. But whether or not and to what extent he actually is responsible for the text that bears his name, namely the Zhuangzi, that's up for grabs. And probably, in my opinion, very little was actually written by him or something. There's lots of stories about him in the Zhuangzi. We'll see some of them here today. But, whether or not he actually wrote the text or how much of the text is his own ideas, we just have no idea. We have no idea. The Zhuangzi is actually an anthology. It's a collection of different writings from about like 150-year period of about the late 300s to the early 200s BC. So that's roughly the time period. These texts were probably collected and maintained by groups of people who came up with different iterations of ideas that maybe trace back to Zhuangzi. We don't actually know, but there are a couple common themes that appear throughout the Zhuangzi, and it's a set of overlapping viewpoints that we find in there. There is no one, philosophy of the Zhuangzi. It's more diverse than that. It's more complicated than that because the texts were written over such a large period of time that the philosophical topics changed and people updated their ideas about stuff. They updated their points of view. There are texts in the Zhuangzi that contradict each other. There's just not one unified point of view to be found in the Zhuangzi, or maybe even in this book of the Zhuangzi, Autumn Floods. The books themselves, right? There's 32 books to the Zhuangzi, at least the version that we have now. Or maybe it's 35, I forget, but it's 30 some odd that we have now. But like the books themselves are compiled by different smaller texts, different shorter little vignettes or bits of prose, stories, all different smaller bits of literature. Sometimes it's just like an aphorism. Sometimes it's a longer discourse. Sometimes it's a bit of prose. Very often it's dialogues in the Zhuangzi. It's like, some conversation between two people. Very often Confucius is a character in the Zhuangzi, right? So Confucius appears much more than Zhuangzi in the Zhuangzi. And usually he says stuff that's, a little bit at odds with the stuff that we find in the Analects of Confucius, for example. So with all that said, that's just to say that, putting together or identifying stuff that makes sense to cover in a video about the Zhuangzi is kind of tricky because there's not really like one point of view. It's not a single authored work. It's not like I can just go through and be like, oh, here's Descartes' attempt to make us smarter or whatever. Let me read through the whole thing, and we can assume the whole time that from start to finish, there's one guy who's responsible for writing this text, whatever it is. He's got one point of view. If he does make a contradiction or make a mistake, then it's his fault, and maybe we can criticize him for it. And it was meant to be read by an audience who had all those assumptions that this is one point of view. One person is expressing this theoretical perspective. We don't get to make any of those assumptions here with the Zhuangzi. These are compiled texts. The people who wrote the little sections in the Zhuangzi and other early Chinese texts probably never met each other, right? They were just, sometimes the term gets used, text-based communities, right? They were groups of people who had a particular viewpoint, philosophy, way of life, style, whatever, and they had texts that sort of compiled their ideas all together, and they roughly, say the same thing, or they have a few shared points of view or perspectives or themes, maybe, but not necessarily, one unified perspective. Okay, so that's sort of what complicates the issue with early Chinese texts, is the nature of authorship itself. Okay. In spite of all that, I'm still going to try and bring more of these texts, and I have two planned already for what to talk about next in the world of Chinese philosophy. Other thing is that because I'm an expert on Chinese thought, I don't really trust many translations, especially not the ones in the public domain. So I'm translating this myself. This is my translation of Autumn Floods. I'll have it posted on my website. You can check it yourself. I wouldn't recommend citing this translation. There's probably better ones, but I did my best. I think it works for most purposes. And there are no copyright issues because I translated it myself. So there you go. Okay, so let's get into the philosophy stuff. So what was going on in ancient China in the context of when this was being written, roughly about the late Warring States period through the Qin dynasty, which was very short, and then the early days of the Han dynasty. Basically, there was this debate over the Tao, the way. Namely, what's the best way to run society, and what's the best way to live your life? Where the Tao is the answer to both of those questions, right? So there was this period in early Chinese history, well, maybe not that early, but about 2,000 some odd years ago, where there were different warring states fighting over control of the majority of the territory that makes up modern China. And there were different like semi-autonomous, well, they were autonomous or de facto autonomous independent states that were each trying to, take over their neighbors and conquer other states and, unify the empire, right? And during that time period, there were different groups of thinkers and strategists and politicians who had different ideas of what's the best way to do that, right? What's the best way to do that? And so Confucius was one of them, right? Confucius himself was one of these political advisors who wanted to figure out a way to organize society, who had a way. He had an idea of how to organize society that would best serve the interests of the most people, that would produce the best form of government, and things like that, or the best behavior for the people who were in charge of society. There's not really much debate about forms of government in early China. There's no debate between like democracy or monarchy or aristocracy or whatever it is. It's pretty much it's monarchy, right? There's a ruler, and the ruler has people below him, and they have people below them, and there's this very structured hierarchical society. And the idea is how best to behave oneself in that context, right? There were other thinkers as well, so like the Daoists, for example, who had their own ideas, and they disagreed with the Confucians about different issues relating to, the value of prominent displays of wealth on the part of government officials, for example, right? They disagreed about that. And many other things. And maybe we'll do some videos on the Daoists. I would love to. They're a lot of fun, but it's tricky with the textual issues. And the Zhuangzi represents a collection of texts that express a series of viewpoints that are mostly critical of these projects to try and identify the one single best way to live. Like the project of Confucius, right? Who is convinced that there is a Tao, there is a way to live, there is a way to organize society. Here it is. You just got to do it, right? The Zhuangzi people say that's probably not going to work. That's probably wrong. The assumptions that go into producing such a view are wrong. And in fact, that's not even the way the Tao actually works. If you really understand the Tao, then you're going to come up with very different answers from what Confucius is saying. And that's one of the reasons why this group gets called Daoist, right? Because they came up with a conception of the Tao that is much more comprehensive, much more metaphysical, maybe borderline mystical, compared with the Confucians, where the Tao is something that guides human conduct in particular. That's very rough outline of what's going on, but you need to know what the Zhuangzi is reacting to in order to get anything out of it in terms of the positive project of what you should do instead, right? You need to know who these people are arguing against and the sort of view that they're criticizing. Okay. I think that's enough for intro stuff. How long was that? 13 minutes. Okay, so a little longer than perfect, but let's do it. This is only 12 pages, so it's probably not going to be like a 3-hour thing, which is, I don't know, maybe a good thing. But yeah, let's get into it. Again, I translated this myself. You can read along on my website. I wouldn't cite it in professional work. I mean, you can if you want to, I guess, but it's not published anywhere. It's just on my website. This is just my translation of Autumn Floods. And there we go. Here's my little intro. The main dialogue of Autumn Floods and the sections that follow encapsulate many of the themes found elsewhere in the Zhuangzi anthology. It thereby offers an effective introduction to the main contours of Zhuangzi thought. Yes, it does. I wrote this. The dialogue blends both metaphysical and ethical elements in an effort to illustrate a conception of living well informed by an appreciation of our necessarily limited perspectives and the futility of arising at a once and for all universal system of value. Yeah, so this is like the main theme. And this gets repeated elsewhere in the Zhuangzi, but I like this text in particular because it's presented very clearly. This was probably a later text compared to some other stuff we find in the Zhuangzi, but it's also quite unique in how long it is and how coherent it is. Like most of the Zhuangzi, I would say most of the episodes or dialogues or stories in the Zhuangzi are shorter, but Autumn Floods goes through like a few topics at some length, and so it ends up being a pretty solid introduction to basically the thought of the Zhuangzi more generally. Not to say that it agrees with everything in the Zhuangzi, but it's a pretty good intro to a lot of the fun ideas that we find elsewhere. So that's why I'm going to it. But yeah, one of the main ideas is our perspectives are limited. Right? We have a limited perspective. We think we know it all, but we really don't. We're actually very small. And our perspectives are very small. And as a result, this idea that we can identify a universal system of value that works in all cases, or that we can, to put it in modern terms, identify an objective system of morality or ethics, that's just not going to work. It's not going to work. So this is why the Zhuangzi sometimes gets called a skeptical text. What it's skeptical of is quite specific. It's not like, David Hume's skepticism, right? It's a very different sort of skepticism. It's skeptical of like certain things, certain specific elements of early Chinese philosophical discourse. That's what it's skeptical of. But nevertheless, it gets called skeptical, and it is in a lot of important ways. Okay, there we go. Importantly, the text does so. It presents all this within the broader context of a critique of a particular conception of the good life promoted by moralizing thinkers of the day, including Confucius, whose perspective remains limited by a commitment to the goodness of a single corner of the way, rather than to an appreciation of its cosmic enormity. Right. So there's this idea that the people who promote the Tao in a moral sense, right? People like Confucius and the Daoists and others, they're just looking at one part of the Tao, one corner of the Tao, one chu of the Tao, rather than like the big picture, right? The Tao is actually like really, really big, and it doesn't necessarily coincide with people's everyday moral sentiments. Sometimes it does, but it certainly doesn't coincide with the weird and wacky moral sentiments of the Confucians, according to this text, right? Aside from the moral thinkers, the chapter also ridicules the sophists or logicians, Gongsunlong and Huizi. These are two characters that were associated with the 100 schools of thought. Basically think the sophists of ancient Greece or the logicians, who, well, they were really interested in logic. They were interested in paradoxes of language. They were philosophers, really, for lack of a better term, where they were interested in coming up with paradoxes. Gongsunlong was a guy who has a famous paradox that white horses are not horses. That's like the idea where there are certain things that you can predicate to white horses that you can't predicate to horses in general, and for that reason white horses are not horses. But everybody knows that white horses are horses, but then how does this difference come into play with how we refer to stuff as a white horse or not? So stuff like that, right? And the Zhuangzi thinks that a lot of that stuff is ridiculous, but in a different way, because a lot of people thought that stuff was ridiculous. But the Zhuangzi, well, it has its own version of the critique of that, and it's similar to the critique of the moral thinking as well, right? Because these guys thought that once we figure out language, and once we figure out logic, then maybe we'll get at the Tao that way. What emerges from the text is a characteristically Zhuangist humility, among other virtues, that promises an inner peace and freedom, right? So that's another thing I really like about the Zhuangzi, is that it gives very sensible advice. Advice that, if you've seen my Epictetus video, kind of resembles what we find in Stoicism in terms of the where you want to end up, and the idea of understanding what you can and can't control, and focusing on the things that you can control, and understanding how limited your sphere of influence is in life, and things like that. And sort of a general humility, we could say. Okay. Translation below attempts to make the text accessible to modern English readers without doing too much violence to the original Chinese. Yeah, that's the goal. The main commentary consulted for textual and interpretive decisions is the version prepared by Cheng Guiying, though I will identify any departures from his edition in the footnotes. Right, so there are different versions of the Zhuangzi, and there's a very long tradition of commentaries where people would read the text in the original ancient Chinese and say, I don't know what that means. Probably this character is a mistake, right? Because there are all sorts of mistakes as the people copying the characters and preparing different versions and editions of it would, make mistakes of their own, and they would try to change the characters to have it make sense, or, nobody knew what that character meant anymore, or it's a character that refers to some type of fish or some type of tree or some biological category that we don't have anymore, right? There's lots of allusions to different elements of early Chinese culture that were lost over the years, and people tried to make sense of it. And now there are some modern editions that do a very good job of making sense of it, but there's lots of disagreement about even some basic editorial decisions, right? So I'm following Cheng Guiying most of the time. But also the edition by Li Mian is pretty good, and the James Legge translation is okay. James Legge, he knows Chinese. He's not crazy creative with the text, so usually he's pretty faithful. That one's also for free. You can go see it on ctext.org. And Graham's translation is pretty good too sometimes. He's a bit creative. He has his own way of reading the Zhuangzi, but he definitely knows Chinese, so that's good. The numbered paragraphs follow the divisions by most modern commentaries. That's fine. And I have in some cases further divided these sections into smaller paragraphs for readability, and I've also added in some notes. So there you go. That's what we're after. Cool. Okay. So let's get to the text. Let's get to the main thing. All right. Here's Autumn Floods by the Zhuangzi, a mere 20 minutes into the video on autumn floods. There you go. The main text. And this is book 17 of the Zhuangzi, and this is the first section. Again, there are different sections. I'll probably divide it in the timestamps. I'll keep the main dialogue as one section, and then the other dialogue, or the other little bits, I'll section off. But I'll just ignore the numbers for now when I'm reading. Okay. The autumn floods arrived, and the 100 streams poured into the Yellow River. Its surging currents were so great, and the river banks were separated by so much water, that someone looking from one side to the other couldn't distinguish between an ox or a horse. So, yeah, that's why, that's where the name comes from, right? The floods of autumn have arrived, right? There's lots of rain in China in the autumn time, or I guess that's part of the rainy season. Or at least it was back then. Who knows with climate change? But regardless, the floods came, and all the water poured into the Yellow River, and the river surged, and the banks were so far separated that you couldn't tell from one side of the river to the other if something was an ox or a horse. Now, this use of ox and horse is interesting and important because it just shows how deeply invested the Zhuangzi was into the philosophy and logic of early China more generally, because ox and horse are two stock examples, right? These often get mentioned in philosophical writings as sort of paradigmatic examples of the application of one's perceptual faculties, right? So in philosophical writings about perception or about illusion or about even logic, right? These show up as examples in philosophical writings quite often, right? Ox or a horse, right? So, this is just a, sort of offhand allusion just to let you know that, okay, these guys know their philosophy, right? So that's kind of just like a signal to the reader. The River Lord was delighted by the situation and was so pleased with himself that he took himself to contain all the world's beauty. So the River Lord, there's a lord, this is a dialogue between the Lord of the River and the North Sea, right? So there are two mythological characters talking to one another. And right now we're talking about the River Lord, who was so happy with the floods that he was very proud of himself. That look at how beautiful the floods are, look at all the water coming down, look at the water level rising, look at how powerful all my floods are. This is wonderful. So following the river's current eastwards, he eventually arrived at the North Sea. And when he arrived, he faced east and looked intently, but could not see where its waters end. The River Lord then turned back around and looked back at his work. Then he turned back towards the North Sea, and he said to God with a sigh, or said to its God with a sigh. There's a rustic saying that goes, when somebody hears the way 100 times, he thinks that nobody else can compare. This is really about me. I've heard of people making light of the teachings of Confucius and demeaning the righteousness of Boyi, and at first I didn't believe them. But now I've seen your sheer infinitude. Had I not arrived at your doorstep, I would still be in trouble, continuing to relish within the confines of my own domain. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, the River Lord is very happy with his floods. Everything's going great. He's very proud at how the water has risen so much and everything, is going his way. And he follows the trace of the river all the way to the end until he reaches the ocean. And then he sort of has an oh shit moment. His jaw drops to the floor and he says, wow, I can't see the end. This thing is massive, right? This thing is massive. And then he, when he gets there, he looks back at his own little river and he says, well, maybe I'm not all that. Maybe I'm not that great. And he looks back and says to the god of the North Sea, well, I heard of people who think very highly of themselves and end up actually being, nobodies who don't really know anything. And it turns out I'm one of these people. Right? And at first I didn't get how people could make light of the teachings of Confucius or the righteousness of Boyi, who was we'll talk more about him later, but he was somebody who's famous for his virtue, basically. And at first I didn't believe that you could demean these two guys because they're so important and they're so righteous and they're so wonderful. But then, having my perspective totally destroyed by looking at the ocean for the first time, that has convinced me that, well, there's probably a similar sort of analogy to be drawn between viewing the world the way that Confucius wants you to view it, between that perspective and a much bigger perspective, right? From the perspective of the Tao or the way. I've translated the Tao as the way here and throughout. So when I say the way, that means the Tao. Okay, so he's convinced that, well, now that my perspective has been destroyed and I'm no longer super excited about my own little floods, which, I thought they were the coolest thing ever, but it turns out not all that great. Good thing I came to the ocean to see and have my perspective destroyed. So he's like, he's relieved to have been enlightened in this way, even though it cost him the satisfaction of thinking that all the world's beauty is contained within him. Okay, next section. The North Sea replied as follows. You can't discuss the ocean with a frog in a well, as he's limited by his living space. You can't discuss the autumn with a summer insect, as it is restricted by its lifespan. You can't discuss the way with the corner scholars, for they are shackled by their teachings. Okay, a lot going on here. So this idea of a frog in a well. This is a popular and fun Zhuangzian image of a frog that's very happy in a little, nasty hole in the ground full of water and broken rocks and bugs. And it's just like, kind of nasty, right? But the frog is super happy in there and thinks that it's the best thing in the world. And if you try to tell a frog about, hey, there's this like thing out there, it's water as far as you can see, it never ends, it's just bigger than anything you could possibly imagine, the frog just won't get it. It doesn't mean anything to the frog. The frog can't even comprehend that. And we see this analogy with basically between that and ways of life or philosophies, right? So you can't discuss the way with the corner scholars, for they are shackled by their teachings. And by corner scholars, we mean people who focus on one corner of the way while neglecting the full picture. So like Confucius is one of these people, right? Who's shackled by being committed to one particular way of life, one way, one Tao, for organizing society and for conducting oneself, right? You can't discuss like the way, the Tao in the cosmic sense with those people, because they're just like, that would be like trying to tell a frog about the ocean, right? So that's the analogy that's being drawn here. Having left the confines of your banks and shores, you have now seen the greatness of the sea, in turn coming to recognize your shamefulness in being so prideful. Now, though, you're able to learn about the great patterns, right? So he's saying, you've made it out, you've managed to expand your perspective, you've gotten out of your own little world. Now we can talk to you about the great patterns, right? Which is like the way things really are, kind of. For all the water in the world, none is greater than the sea. So this is the North Sea speaking. The myriad rivers all return to it. I know of no time when they stopped flowing, but it's never really full. The remotest villages take from it. I know of no time when they did not, but it's never empty. It doesn't change with the passage of the seasons. It doesn't know flood or droughts. It exceeds the flow of the Jiang and the He rivers beyond measure. That said, I've never used these facts to puff myself up. I received my form from heaven and earth, and I received my breath from yin and yang. I liken my existence between heaven and earth to that of a small rock or tree on a great mountain. And as I maintain my perspective of myself as something small, how could I instead consider myself great? Right, so here the North Sea is saying, look, the ocean is like the biggest thing that, or at least in terms of bodies of water, there's like nothing bigger than it, right? And it kind of breaks all the rules of any other body of water that you might be familiar with inland, right? Where there's no, the rivers all flow into it, but it doesn't actually like increase the water level. The remotest villages take from it. I guess the distinction between salt water and fresh water isn't like super important in this case, but regardless, right? Everybody drinks water, but it doesn't really lower the sea levels. It doesn't change during the seasons, right? It gets a little colder, I guess, in the winter, but like it doesn't go higher or lower. It doesn't really change. There's no floods or droughts in the ocean. And it's just like massive, right? But given all that, in spite of all that, I still consider myself small, right? I'm not a big deal. I don't make a big deal out of this. I maintain my perspective as something kind of small. And I remember this, I'm just a little rock or a tree on a great mountain, right? I'm just, something in the universe that, isn't very significant or big, even though all this other stuff is true. There is a perspective from which I am very big, but I don't use that to, make much of myself, because I remember the perspective from which I'm actually quite small. Consider the four seas within the great expanse of heaven and earth. Do they not resemble a small mound within a vast wetland? Consider the central states occupying its place within the great expanse of the sea. Is it not like a grain of rice within a massive granary? When we refer to all things, we use the number 10,000, and humankind constitutes but one of them. We speak of the people living in the 9 provinces, but those places where grains and food are grown, and where boats and carts can pass through, make up just a small portion of all that land. Compared to the 10,000 things, does it not resemble the tip of a single hair on the body of a horse? Right. So these are all just examples of trying to drive home the point that, even though life may seem very big and important to us, there's a perspective from which it's actually quite small, right? As long as we keep that in mind, right? Like, the four seas within the great expanse of heaven and earth, right? This is supposed to be like the biggest sort of territory one could imagine. Isn't there a perspective from which that, the biggest thing in the world just seems very small, right? So he's trying to, I guess, Daniel Dennett, the late great philosopher, would maybe call this like an intuition pump, right? He's trying to get your mind out of this idea that the biggest, what you think of as the biggest things or the most important things in the world are really quite small from another perspective, right? There is a perspective from which those things are tiny, right? Like where all the human beings live compared to like the land where they don't live, right? It's, it seems more like the tip of a hair on a horse, right? The succession of the 5 emperors, the struggle of the 3 kings, the anxieties of benevolent persons, the labor of dutiful scholars, it all took place right here, right? This little, all the great events of history took place in this tiny little speck of land in this, grand physical continuum of the universe, right? Everything that you think of as important and great really took place in a tiny little speck in, the grand scheme of things, right? Bo Yi declined to take over the kingdom and thereby garnered a reputation for virtue. Confucius talked about it and was considered to be broad of learning. Both in turn took themselves to be great. Isn't it just like you taking pride in your floods? Right, so again, Bo Yi was, and I won't read the full footnote, but basically he had the chance to take over the empire or the kingdom, but he declined for various reasons, and this is like supposed to be a great display of his virtue and his principles and his filial piety and things like that. And he gets this reputation for being like, the most virtuous person ever or whatever, right? Confucius, of course, right, also talked about the importance of virtue, and he's considered to be, this grand sagely figure, and both of them took themselves to be great. They both thought very highly of themselves, at least according to the North Sea. Isn't this just like you taking pride in your floods, right? Thinking that you have it all figured out, thinking that everything great in the world is a product of yourself, right? It's a similar kind of vanity or pride that the North Sea is trying to convince the river to abandon, right? So that's the main point of the first little bit here. The river lord then asked, if that's the case, then can I deem heaven and earth great and the tip of a hair small? Right? So the idea is, well, if everything I thought was really big is actually really small, and everything I thought was small is actually really big, or maybe we haven't gotten there yet, then can I say that, like, well, heaven and earth, is that the greatest? And then, like, the tip of a hair, is that the smallest? Right? Can I settle on, if I'm wrong about what's great and what's small, can't you just tell me the right answer then? Like, I can grant that I'm wrong and that, my own floods aren't the greatest thing ever, and that the Confucian Tao, the Confucian way, isn't the greatest thing ever, right? I'm okay with that, but then what's the answer instead? That's the question. So can I say that heaven and earth is like really big, and the tip of a hair, the very tip of a hair, it is what it sounds like, is that small? And the North Sea said, nope, you can't do that. For all things, measurement has no limit. Time never stops. Allotments are not constant, and beginning and end are never fixed. Right. So here's this idea of the constant cycles of everything, including perspectives. And interestingly, he talks about measurement. Right? Measurement has no limit. And again, this is like the Zhuangzi using technical philosophical vocabulary to make a point that, well, philosophy is kind of hopeless. Right? That's really one of the main points here. And he uses this term limit, or tiong, which is defined in later Maoist logical writings, the point at which there is no further room for measurement. That's the technical philosophical definition of tiong, or limit, in ancient China. And the Zhuangzi says that measurement actually has no limit. You can always subdivide something smaller until there is no logical point at which you can't divide things. So that's like a kind of sophisticated point that he makes in 3 words or whatever. Time never stops. Allotments are not constant, and the beginning and ends of things are not fixed. Thus, those of greater knowledge observe what is remote and what is at hand at the same time, and so deem small things without taking them to be meager, and deem things large without taking them to be great, as they understand that measurement is infinite. So, basically the idea is that people who have greater knowledge, right, people who are a bit wiser than the average bear, can accept things as being provisionally small or great without necessarily having the accompanying value judgments about them, or without taking these to be permanent and worthy of a further judgment of the worthiness or the meagerness of something that's large or small. They clearly ascertain both ancient and modern, and so are not troubled by things being far away, gathering wisdom without seeking, as they understand that time never stops. So again, whether or not they're looking at something far away in time or history, or something close by, whether they're thinking about the people in their immediate vicinity or the people very far away, they sort of see all things equally, and they're not troubled by the fact that maybe success is very far off. Okay, success may be far off, but I'm not troubled by it, right? They examine things whether they're full or empty, and comprehend them without being joyous. They acknowledge losses without being disturbed, as they understand the inconstancy of allotments. Right, so they just accept that, well, sometimes things go well, sometimes things don't go well, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's just the way it is. And they can sort of approach all situations with really a stoic kind of equanimity and acceptance of, well, yeah, the allotments, right? What we get apportioned in life, the way that things are divided up, whether it's by nature or by other human beings, it's just inconsistent, right? Sometimes you feel like you get rewarded appropriately for your work. Sometimes you feel shortchanged. Sometimes it feels just right. That's just the way it is, right? Those with greater knowledge are clear regarding the simple path, and so they take neither joy in life nor despair in death, as they understand the fluidity of beginning and end. Right? So the Zhuangzi has a lot to say about death in particular. There's several important passages on death in the Zhuangzi, and kind of like what you might expect from several bits of ancient wisdom, or at least in agreement with certain traditions that even we find in the West, like the Stoics and Epicureans, right? Death is not something to be despaired or feared, because it's just a recycling of one's body and consciousness back into the infinite, back into the Tao, right? It's a fluid process. We come and go, we rise and fall, we're born and we die, right? It's just part of the course of things. You must recognize that what a person knows can scarcely be compared with what one does not know, and that the time a person is alive can scarcely be compared with the time they are not. So this is, kind of a deep but depressing point. I mean, it's not really depressing it doesn't have to be, but the idea is just like, look, life is really, really short, and the stuff that you can learn in your life is like very, very small compared to all the stuff that you're not going to learn throughout your life. And you just have to accept that, right? You can't learn everything. You can't live forever. Life is very, very short, mercilessly short. And there is so much knowledge out there, you can't possibly even scratch the surface, really. So just accept that, right? When you realize that, you can sort of take things a little less seriously and recognize the silliness of taking things very seriously, and, like the philosophers, committing yourself to the idea that there's a way to learn all that needs to be known. Just get rid of that project, because it's not going to work. Thus, when one seeks out the realm of arriving at greatness by means of arriving at smallness, she will be perplexed, disordered, and unable to achieve self-realization. Looking at it from this perspective, how indeed can we know that the tip of a hair is sufficient to settle the boundaries of the microscopic? And how indeed can we know that heaven and earth are sufficient to mark out the limits of the realm of arriving at greatness? So the idea is here, like, when we accept how limited we are and how small we are, how short our lives are, how short our perspectives are, and just how inconstant things are, we can't possibly say once and for all, this thing which appears really small to us actually is, in fact, really small. And this thing that looks really big to us is, in fact, really big. Because our own perspective is so limited and unreliable that we can't possibly make that judgment with absolute confidence or certainty. Right? Cool. The Riverlord said, lots of learned people claim that the subtlest essence has no shape. The largest thing cannot be encircled. Is that true? And the North Sea said, well, from the perspective of something minuscule, what is large is inexhaustible. And from the perspective of something large, what is minuscule is surely subtle. The subtlest essence is but the smallest of the small, and the gigantic is the largest of the large. The difference is a matter of convenience and the possession of the relative powers owing to the circumstances. Right? So, from the perspective of an ant, we are giant. And from the perspective of, the ocean or the sun, we are not. We are very, very small. We're so small you can't even notice us. We don't even exist from the perspective of the sun. And whether we deem things, large or small, even the earth itself is very, very small compared to the sun. And the difference is just a matter of convenience and the relative powers that we have to perceive things as being very small or very large, right? And that's just circumstantial, right? That's just the way it is. So this idea of coming to a precise definition of small or large is just impossible. It's just impossible. And this may seem metaphysical. I mean, he's talking about big and small, right? How is that philosophy, big and small? But it's a metaphor for when you're thinking about big and small perspectives, right? And how you want to run your life in accordance with a perspective that you think as sufficiently broad and big. The text here is, throwing cold water on that, basically. But at the same time, there is metaphysics that's going on here, because this is part of a metaphysical debate, right? So this idea that the subtle essence has no shape and the largest thing cannot be encircled, right? Those are definitions of subtle essence or largeness. And the North Sea is saying, nope, those aren't going to work. It's just a matter of convenience. Subtlety and coarseness both presuppose a thing's having shape. If something has no shape, then it cannot be numerically divided. If something cannot be encircled, then it has no numerical limit. The coarseness of things can be discussed in words, and the subtle essence of things can be reached in thought. Those areas where words cannot discuss or where thoughts cannot reach cannot be ranked among the coarse or subtle. So, I guess the idea here is, again, it's the limit of our perspectives, right? where there's going to be a point at which we just can't perceive something because it's so small. And we can't even think about it. We can't even conceive of it. There's a limit to what our minds can perceive or conceive theoretically in terms of how small something is. I mean, think about just comprehending the idea of 1,000,000 years, for example. We can barely comprehend, decades in one person's life. The idea of 10 years ago, what does that feel like? Conceptualize 10 years ago in your head. Okay, now try 100 years ago. It gets a little fuzzy. Now try 1,000 years ago. So, okay, well that's like, okay, how many generations is that? Like, trying to continue. Okay, now do 1,000,000 years. Okay, many millions of years. Dinosaurs died, 65 million years ago. Life on Earth, hundreds of millions of years, right? It becomes difficult for us to even really comprehend that stuff. And because that's possible, because we can, make ourselves dizzy trying to think about extreme cases of size or length, whether it's extremely big or extremely small, this idea of finding a definition that fits with the infinitude of measurement is just hopeless. It's just hopeless. Okay, now we get this passage. Chen Guiying thinks that this whole paragraph is unoriginal. It's just a later addition, and it wasn't originally part of the dialogue. I don't know. This is what people do with the Zhuangzi. They just decide that, like, I don't like that part. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit really well. Let's get rid of it. I'm more conservative with the text. I don't like changing it if it doesn't need to be changed. I think that the version that tradition has provided to us should be, only changed in extreme circumstances. So we'll just keep going, in spite of Chen Guiying's contention about this passage. Maybe there's a better place that it fits. I mean, and again, like, this probably wasn't all written at once, right? This wasn't written by one person. This is like a compilation of wisdom, variations on a theme, a set of writings that were originally separate, that got put together into this dialogue. And the fact that it's even in like a dialogue itself is kind of impressive. So the idea that this passage is written by somebody else and was just stuck in this dialogue because somebody thought that it fit well, that's totally possible. It's totally possible. And because of that, I'm like, well, if it could have come from anywhere, why not just stick it here where it is? Or just leave it here where it's been stuck? And there you go. Okay. Thus, the conduct of the great person does not issue from the intention to harm others, though she does not think much of her benevolence and charity. She does not act for the sake of benefit, but nor does she look down on her subordinates. She does not struggle for wealth or riches, but nor does she make much of her reluctance and deference. She doesn't begrudge the help of others, and she doesn't make much of relying on her own strength. Nor, however, does she look down on the greedy and impure. Her conduct departs from mere custom, but she does not make much of her uniqueness. Where her actions do accord with the masses, she does not disparage the flatterers. The ranks and riches of the world are not enough to encourage her, and punishment and humiliation are not enough for her to consider it disgraceful. She knows that shirt and fey cannot be apportioned, and that the minuscule and great cannot be distinguished. Thus I have heard it said, the person of the way is unheard of. The utmost virtue is not realized. The great person has no self. These are the utmost divisions. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. Probably if this was written separately, it got added here because of this, right? That the minuscule and the great cannot be distinguished, right? Because that's like the topic of this. So this is like the metaphysics stuff, and then it gets to the ethics. Then it gets like the description of the great person, right? The great person. And the great person is somebody who understands all this stuff, understands the limitation of our perspective, understands how we can't come to a final agreement about what's big or small or what's right or wrong, and lives in accordance with that, right? Lives this kind of happy, borderline stoic medium where this person can just do what's kind of right, what's situationally appropriate, do her own thing, but live kind of freely, things like that. This sort of classic Taoist detachment here, and there's lots of specific allusions that are being made in these, in each line here. So, for example, right, the ranks and riches of the world are not enough to encourage her, and the punishment and humiliation are not enough for her to consider it disgraceful. So these two ideas get mentioned in other early Chinese texts, and they're actually associated with a different philosopher by the name of Zhuangzi, of Song Zhuangzi, who's not somebody we really know very much about, but he's somebody who's associated with several slogans. He actually appears in the Zhuangzi as somebody who is not motivated by wealth and honor, right? And the idea is that this is something kind of unique and admirable, right? That you can't be motivated or spurred to action by the prospect of a lot of money or power or wealth. This idea of being detached and unmoved by material things was considered admirable, at least to the Taoists, right? For everyone else, it was kind of normal, I guess, right? But in this description of the great person, the idea is somebody who can be so detached and unmoved by the prospect of ranks and riches. That's that's a good thing. And punishment and humiliation are not enough for her to consider it disgraceful. This position gets argued against directly in the Xunzi, that to be humiliated is a disgrace. Right? There's this debate between Xunzi and Songzi about whether or not you should feel disgraced when you're being humiliated. Right? If somebody starts insulting you, should you feel bad about it? That's not really the best way to describe that disagreement. It's much more subtle and important than that. But there's this controversy here. And the guy Zhuangzi is associated with both of these ideas, even though he's not mentioned by name. But that's, again, this text has lots of allusions to other things and other texts and other ideas that the audience probably would have recognized. She knows that shirt and fei cannot be apportioned and that the minuscule and great cannot be distinguished. Right? So the minuscule and great cannot be distinguished. That's just what we talked about up here. But knowing that shirt and fei cannot be apportioned. So shirt and fei are basically the ancient Chinese concepts of right and wrong. That's one way to understand it. At least in a normative sense, or in a moral or ethics sense, shirt and fei often mean right or wrong. But they also have a more sort of logical function of just being a general endorsement or rejection, or even a descriptive term, meaning that a thing is this or it's not this, right? So like sure is often just used as this, the word for like this thing. It's a this, it's not something else, sure, and fei, right? And it also means right and wrong, right? So these words have very general applicability as sort of generic terms for endorsement or rejection. And that's why I sort of leave them untranslated. But here you can understand them as right and wrong. And I have a little note about that too. But the idea was that for people like Confucius and others, you could figure out a way of determining shirt and fei, right and wrong, this and not, that's consistent and universal and can be applied to anyone and anything and all situations, right? That was kind of like the goal of identifying the Tao, was to figure out how to figure out sure and fei once and for all, how to teach people how to distinguish right and wrong, sure and fei, this and not this, how to use language correctly in a way that's consistent and that everyone can agree on, right? And the Zhuangzi is skeptical of that, right? The Zhuangzi says that just can't be done, right? Things are inconsistent. You can't find a once and for all way of determining right and wrong, good and bad, this and not this, right? Because there's always some perspective from which things are not that way. And then we have the, this quote, the person of the way is unheard, meaning that they don't have a reputation, right? Somebody who really gets it probably doesn't have a reputation. It's probably not somebody you've ever heard of. The utmost virtue is not realized, and the great person has no self. This idea, the great person has no self, and these slogans appear throughout the Zhuangzi and other places and other sort of Daoist writings. So it's no surprise they show up here. Okay. The River Lord said, regarding both what is external to things and what is internal to things, how can we arrive at the distinction between the prized and the worthless? How can we arrive at the distinction between small and great? So here the River Lord is still pushing, right? The River Lord is still like, well, if that's the case, how can I figure out what I should value? How can I figure out what I should care about and what I shouldn't care about? And how do I go about determining what's small and what's great? I need to do that in my daily life. I need to figure out what I should prize and what I shouldn't. And I need to figure out the way that stuff works in general if I'm going to survive. So, we'll give you some guidance here. And the North Sea said, from the perspective of the way, things are neither prized nor worthless. From the perspective of the thing itself, it prizes itself and deems others as worthless. From the common perspective, a thing's being prized or not lies in the thing itself. From the perspective of their differences, from the common perspective, a thing's being prized or not lies not in the thing itself. So, right. So this is all about perspective. From the perspective of the way, right? The way, the Tao, the big picture, the way that the cosmos unfolds, the way that all things proceed in the universe, the unfolding of the universe, a temporally extended, four-dimensional conception of the universe and everything inside it. From that perspective, nothing is prized or worthless, right? There's no way of making sense of those categories. They're just so small and insignificant and useless and imprecise that if we're really talking about from the perspective of the Tao, that stuff doesn't apply really. There's nothing like being prized or worthless. But from the perspective of the thing itself, it thinks itself prized, it values the self, and everything else is less important, right? And that's sort of the way things are. That seems kind of true. So from my perspective, I'm so great, and everything else is not as great as me, right? From the common perspective, a thing's being prized or not lies not in the thing itself, right? It means it's deeming things great or not is usually a matter of who is doing the evaluating, right? It's not an intrinsic property. I think that's what's being claimed here. From the perspective of their differences, if you use what is great about it as a criterion for deeming things great, then nothing is not great. If you use what is small about it as a criterion and deem it small, then nothing is not small. When you know heaven and earth to be a grain of rice, or know the tip of a hair to be a hill or a mountain, then the difference in number can be ascertained. From the perspective... I'll explain that a bit, right? So, if you use what's small about a thing and then deem it small, then you can make anything small. If I say that I am small because my finger is small, and this is actually a bit of early Chinese logic, right? So some qualities of things are distributed evenly throughout the thing, right? So, I don't know, my iPad case is gray. This little part of it is gray, and the whole thing is gray, right? So even if I just focus on this little part and say, like, this part of it is gray, the whole thing is also gray. There's some controversy about how and whether and which properties work that way and which ones don't. For example, there's one example in the Daoists where they're talking about people being black or not. And, they use the term black person, but they're really talking about people whose hair is black. And on the basis of their hair, they deem the person black rather than some other feature, right? And the question is, like, which features should we focus on to determine the kind of thing that it is? And so even though it might be intuitive to say, like, well, if I just say that my finger is small, that doesn't mean that I'm small, right? I'm very large compared to my finger. The response would be, but your finger is a part of you, and your finger is small. Therefore, you are small. So this is like this sort of logical questions and paradoxes and issues that early Chinese thinkers or that some early Chinese thinkers, I should say, were interested in. And this is kind of an example of that, right? If you use what is small to determine a thing's smallness, then nothing is not small, right? Everything's got some part of it that we can use to fix our definition or understanding of the thing overall, right? If for example, like, are trees green or brown, right? Most people associate trees with being green, but that's just because the leaves are green. But the bark itself, and most of the year when there are no leaves, it's brown. And actually it's gray, if we're being really precise, not even brown. So, so are trees green or brown, right? It's like, it's kind of tricky because we have to decide how properties work and things like that. So basically, like, anything goes is what's being said here. Anything goes when it comes to small or great or prized or not, right? When you know heaven and earth to be a grain of rice or the tip of a hair to be a hill or a mountain, then the difference in number can be ascertained, right? So the tip of a hair, right, if you were to put it under a microscope, it would look massive, and there's like this whole, bioculture living on your hair, which is kind of gross, but like, you don't see it because it's so small, so it doesn't matter. But if you were to blow it up with like a microscope, you'd be like, wow, there's lots of really interesting stuff going on there. It's huge. My hair, the tip of my hair is massive compared to all the little creatures living on it. And the text is saying, yeah, like that. So like, from their perspective, the hair is massive, right? It's a hill or mountain, right? From the perspective of accomplishments, when you use what a thing has as the criterion for deeming it as having something, then nothing is lacking. And if you use what a thing lacks to deem it as lacking in general, then nothing is not lacking, right? So there's always a perspective from which you're a failure or from which you're super successful, right? If you just focus on the things that you've accomplished, then guess what? You've accomplished things, right? And if you just focus on the things that you haven't accomplished, then yes, you're a failure, right? Once you understand that East and West are opposed to one another but cannot exist without one another, then you'll see that the division of achievements is settled. From the perspective of interests, if you use what is so of it to deem it so, then nothing is not so, right? So from the perspective of whatever you're interested in, if you use what is so of something to deem it as so, then nothing is not so. So again, like those examples I was talking about before, right? Like whether the iPad is gray or whether the trees are green or brown, right? The idea is, well, whatever you're interested in, right? Whatever thing you have, basically you decide. Your interests decide the way things are, basically, right? If you're interested in leaves, then trees are green, right? If you're interested in the bark, then the trees are brown or gray or whatever, right? And that's all you need. You just need to deem it so, and then it becomes so, right? All I need to do is determine that I'm interested in the greenness of the trees, and on that basis, I deem the trees to be green, therefore they're green. And that's it. That's really the end of it, right? Because it's just based on your interest. There's no disagreement there, objectively speaking. There's just a difference in interest, right? I say, no, trees are actually brown or gray. And, well, the difference isn't that we're looking at two different things, or that we're one of us is failing to use our eyes the right way, or we're not seeing things clearly, right? We're just interested in different things. I'm interested in the bark, you're interested in the leaves, right? Then nothing is not so in that situation. If you use what is fey, what is not this, or wrong, to deem something fey, then nothing is not fey, right? Okay, so there's this might have been, there might be some textual issues going on here, right? So usually, so, the word for so, contrasts not so. There's two different ways of expressing that. One is buran, and the other one is fo. But instead of being contrasted with one of those, it's being contrasted with fei, which usually is contrasted not with ran, but with sure. So this could be shorthand, but basically, right, the way things are and things being right or wrong is just a matter of what you're focusing on, right? If you understand that Yao, the ancient sage, and Jie, the ancient tyrant, each took himself to be so, while deeming the other one fei, right? Each took himself to be right, while the other one was wrong, then the interest in the question can be understood. Yeah, so, again, right, there's different, it depends on what you're interested in. What are you after? That will determine the way you see the world. Formerly, Yao yielded the throne to Shun and became emperor, while Kui, the king of Yan, yielded the throne to Chancellor Zhi, but the rule was cut short. Right, so these are just two examples of like, the same thing happened with dramatically different outcomes. Right, so Emperor Yao gave the throne to Shun, and everything was great. Right? It was a really good call. It was a good move. But a similar thing happened. I have a footnote about this. During the Warring States period. So this would have been like a more recent event when some guy also yielded the throne and gave over the throne to another guy, but it was a complete disaster. Right? So same thing happened, totally different outcome. Tang and Wu fought for the throne and became kings, while Bai Gong fought for the throne and was eliminated. Again, these are just examples of kind of doing the same thing, having the same general approach, the same action, whatever, but totally different outcome, totally different. From this perspective, the ritual propriety of yielding and contending, the conduct of Yao and Jie, and the seasonality of being prized or worthless, none of these can be consistently maintained. So, right, in some cases, yielding the throne is good, in other cases it's not so good. Sometimes fighting for your position is good, other times it's not. And in consequence, being prized or worthless is also something that can't be consistently determined. It's just a matter of what you prize or what you don't. A battering ram can be used against the city wall, but it cannot be used to fill a hole. This is called the uniqueness of the instruments. The legendary horses, Qiji and Ma Liu, could gallop 1,000 li in a single day, but it would not be as good as a fox or a weasel in catching rats. This is called the uniqueness of skills. The horned owl collects fleas at night and can observe the tip of a hair, because it has very good eyesight. But during the daytime, it just glares angrily and cannot even see a mound or a hill. This is called the uniqueness of natures. So the idea here is that things are different. Things are diverse. Things have their own settings, their own ways of life, their own perspectives, their own strengths and weaknesses, and they're not suited to all situations. There's no one-size-fits-all quality that works in all situations, or being good at one thing is not necessarily transferable to another situation. Thus it is said, why not follow what is right and have nothing to do with what is wrong? Why not follow what is orderly and have nothing to do with what is chaotic? And this is something that the moral philosophers of early China would have wanted to do. Like, absolutely. Just follow what is right, follow the shi, and reject, have nothing to do with what is wrong, fei. Follow what is orderly and reject what is chaotic. This is pretty much the project of early Chinese moral thinkers like Confucius and the Daoists. But according to the Zhuangzi, this shows a lack of clarity with respect to the patterns of heaven and earth and the essential features of the myriad things. It is really akin to honoring heaven while having nothing to do with earth, or honoring yin while having nothing to do with yang, which is something that clearly cannot be carried out. So the idea of only following what is shi and never having anything to do with what is fei, that's just foolish. It'll never work. Shi and fei are two opposing forces, and we need both of them to function. And they aren't very consistent either, because some days you deem something right, some days you deem it wrong, and the times change, moral intuitions change, the circumstances change, and our moral judgments are not very consistent. And that's just the way things are. And the idea that you could ever make them consistent is kind of a fool's errand. So it cannot be carried out. Nevertheless, they talk this way without stopping. If they're not stupid, then they're liars. And he's talking about Confucius and his followers and the moralizing people. The 5 emperors of the past had unique circumstances in which they yielded the throne, and the 3 dynasties had their own unique ways of passing down the throne. One who departs from the times and rebels against custom is called a usurper. One who goes along with the times and obeys custom is called a follower of duty. Hush, River Lord, how could you possibly know the groupings of the prized and the worthless, or the houses of small and great? So, again, to just reject the question. There's no way that you can absolutely once and for all know what's small and great, what's prized or worthless. You just can't know that for sure. You just can't. There isn't a way to divide it up consistently, because things change, times change. Sometimes behavior is appropriate, other times it's not appropriate. Sometimes the same thing will work, other times it won't work. And it really just depends on what you're interested in. That's kind of what determines the way that you divide things up, is your own perspective on them. Whether it's informed by your own personal interest or bias, or just constrained by your human nature and the kind of thing that you are. That you're going to be interested in, I don't know, sweet foods or fatty foods instead of, grass, like a cow, right? But there is no one best food to eat compared with, grass or, I don't know, meat. At least that's the point. Okay, and now at this point, the River Lord is like, what's going on here? If that's the case, then what do I do? Well, what should I do? What should I not do? What ultimately ought I refuse or accept? What should I pursue or dwell in? Right? Pursue or just sort of hang out? What should I do? That's what the River Lord is asking. Well, you tell me all this stuff. You say everything's crazy, everything's messed up, everything's all over the place. We can't be consistent about our judgments. What do I do? And the North Sea said, well, from the perspective of the way, what can be prized and what can be worthless? Call it cycling through the changes. Don't have rigid or firm intentions, or you'll be too incapacitated to follow the way. What should we belittle and what should we pride ourselves on? How about letting things have their turn? Don't be single-minded in your conduct, or else you'll depart from alignment with the way. Be stern, like the ruler of a state with an impartial virtue. Be placid, like the spirit being sacrificed to, dispersing bounty impartially. Be broad, like the infinitude of the four corners of the earth, without boundaries or borders. If you keep all the myriad things close to your heart, what would receive any special assistance? Call it being without any particular direction. If the myriad things are all equal, then which would be short and which would be long? The way has no end or beginning, but things have both life and death, without relying upon being complete in any respect, at one point empty, at one point full, neither being determined by a thing's form. The years cannot be refused, and time doesn't stop. Decay and growth, fullness and emptiness recycle. With any end, there is a beginning. This is how to discuss the method of the greatest duty, and how to discourse the order of all things. The lives of things are like a trot or gallop of a horse. There is no movement without change, no moment without alteration. What to do, what not to do. Merely steel yourself to go along with the transformation of things. So there you go. That's like a nice encapsulation of Daoist wisdom and suggestion for how to live your life. Don't get too attached to stuff. Things change. Try and go with the flow. Really, like, this is where it comes from. Go with the flow. Like, that's Daoism, right? This is it. Don't try and be too attached or partial to things. That's like one of the main themes here. Let each thing have its turn, right? Let each thing have its turn. Sometimes you're interested in, get McDonald's. Other times you're interested in eating healthy food, eating a salad, right? Sometimes you feel like going one way. Sometimes you feel like going another way. Call it being without any particular direction, right? And sort of treat things as equal because, they are kind of all equal from the perspective of the Tao. And there you go. I don't know. Yeah, the years can't be refused and time doesn't stop. Things just go on. The wheels of time keep turning. And we just sort of gotta, deal with it. And that's it. Once you get that, then that's the greatest duty, the method of the greatest duty. Right? Because life is short. The lives are kind of like the trot or the gallop of a horse. I like that image. That's a nice image. It shows you just how short and insignificant life is. So what should you do? Just sort of, toughen yourself up and be ready to go along with the transformation of things because life is going to take you for a ride. So you better get prepared, So there you go. I like that line. That's 17.6. It's a good section. And the River Lord, he's still going. In that case, then what of the way is to be prized? Right? What should I prize? What part of the way should I prize? If the way doesn't prize anything, then what should I prize within the way? So he's just trying, fishing for just any direction, any sort of guidance on how best to live. And the North Sea says, one who understands the way surely masters the patterns of things. And one who masters the patterns of things is certainly clear-headed in weighing things up. Or Chuan. So we get a little bit of normative guidance or suggestion here of, if you're going to if you do understand the Tao, if you understand the way, and you're beyond this sort of small-minded perspective about things, you're going to exhibit certain qualities. And one of them is being clear-headed about weighing things up. Meaning you can recognize the relative circumstantial value of things depending on the context, right? And you can do that without being attached to any long-term benefits of things being a certain way, right? Without being too attached to the way the world is right now. You can see things more objectively, right? And that's what this idea of weighing things up, or chuan, which literally refers to like a measuring tool, or a scale for weights. And one who is clear-headed in weighing things up will not be harmed by things. Well, that's nice. As for one with the utmost virtue, fire cannot burn him, and water cannot make him wet. Heat and cold cannot harm him, and the birds and beasts cannot hurt him. It's not that he discounts these things. Rather, he's thorough regarding safety or peril, calm regarding calamity or riches, circumspect regarding what he shuns or what he associates with. All this such that nothing is able to harm him. And so it is said, heaven is located within, and humankind is located without. Virtue lies in what comes from heaven. When one understands the conduct of both humankind and heaven, one stays grounded in what comes from heaven, and one becomes established in what comes from virtue. Advance and retreat, contract and stretch, return to the fundamentals, and discourse on the extremities of the way. Okay, so this is kind of like a, again, kind of stoic claim to focus on what you can control and recognize what you cannot control. Or at least recognize what's not in your power. And what's not in your power is the stuff that comes from heaven. So heaven is like here kind of like a deity figure, at least it was earlier on in the tradition, but it sort of throughout the Warring States period gets slowly transforms into something that's a little more like nature, at least by this period, but like nature with a capital N in a sort of grandiose sense of like nature slash a deity slash, it's not really God, but just like the spirit of the natural world sort of thing. And the spirit of the natural world, the spontaneous workings of nature, which we don't have any control over, we should learn to appreciate that stuff and recognize it and stay grounded in it. And then we can become virtuous, right? We can become good. So understanding heaven, right? Understanding nature is going to lead us to virtue. Virtue lies in what comes from heaven, or virtue lies in the heavenly, really, is what's said. And that's a nice Taoist idea. There's other places where this gets treated in a bit more detail, but here it's just sort of squeezed in at the end, just for like a little bit of ethical guidance. But it's part of a broader set of claims about the relationship between heaven and humankind, or the natural world and humanity. And the River Lord says, what can we say comes from heaven, and what can we say comes from humankind? Just clarify for me. The North Sea said, ox and horse have 4 feet. Right, again, here's ox and horse again. Ox and horse have 4 feet. This comes from heaven. The headstalls of a horse's head and the pierced ring of an ox's nose. This comes from humankind. The saying goes, don't let what comes from humankind exterminate what comes from heaven. Don't let what comes from the initial conditions exterminate what comes from fate. Don't let what comes from what is obtained obscure your reputation. Guard it carefully and do not lose it. Call it returning to one's own genuineness. So again, like, this is a little bit obscure. It's a little bit poetic. It's not really, I mean, there's probably a way to understand it a little more clearly, but at the end of the day, the idea is about understanding the relationship between human life, humankind, and what is natural, and sort of accepting and understanding and going along with the natural transformations of things, right? Going with the flow again, and how that is going to be more important than being committed to a certain set of things you should value and a certain set of things you should not value. That's not really the way to do it. The way to do it is to, get yourself mentally ready to go along with the transformation of things. That's the main goal. And how do you do that? Well, you got to understand what transforms naturally. You got to understand that things do transform and that there's a progression to things that exists naturally outside of any human conduct or preference or what have you. Okay, that is the main dialogue. That's the main dialogue between the river and the sea of autumn floods. There you go. Super cool. I love that. It's a fun reading, interesting sort of perspective, blowing experience. It's a lot of fun, and I love reading it. But there's a little bit more. There's a few more pages with a couple different vignettes that are like the editors probably found these texts and it reminded them of stuff in the main dialogue, and that's why they added it in here. But again, like, this wasn't written by the same guy. Probably, I mean, we don't know who wrote it, but it probably wasn't written by the same person. These are probably just collections of writings, and an editor said, oh, that sounds like it fits with like the autumn flood stuff, so let's add it in there. So we'll go over these now. Okay. The Kui envies the Milipede. And the Kui is like a one-legged monster or a type of insect. We don't really know. I don't think we really know. Maybe we do, but it's some kind of thing with one leg, basically. The Kui envies the Milipede. The Milipede envies the snake envies the wind envies the eye, and the eye envies the mind. Okay, so that's like a summary of the little bit of dialogue that we get that follows. The Kui said to the Milipede, I hop around with 1 foot and can hardly manage it, but now you have 10,000 feet. What's up with that? The Milipede said, Not so. Haven't you seen somebody spit? The biggest wad is like a pearl, but the smallest parts are like the mist. The two are inextricably and uncountably mixed together. Now I move along with my heavenly machinery, but I don't know what makes it so. So this is like a kind of fun, classic Zhuangzian story where it's like two little animals, two creatures talking to one another. And the one with one leg says, hey, you got like, a bunch of legs. You got like 1 million legs over there, buddy. Or 10,000, right? Which is just shorthand for like many, many, many. What's up with that? And the Millipede, like, how did you do that? Or like, I don't know. There's different ways you can like understand like the actual question that he asks. I just have it translated as "What's up with that?" Yeah, some sort of interrogative. But the Millipede responds as well. Things are all mixed up. I don't know. I've got all these legs. I just, it just came from heaven, right? It's just my heavenly machinery. That's like my translation of Tianji, of the term that's being used there. And I don't know how it works, but yeah, I got all these legs and I move along. I don't really know how or why. There you go. And that's like the answer. Okay. And then the Millipede says to the snake, look, I got all these feet, but I can't keep up with you, and you don't have any feet. What's up with that? And the snake said, well, for all those things who move about with their heavenly machinery, how could it be any different? What use could I possibly have for feet, right? How, I get along this way. This is how I was designed. I don't have any feet. I just move along on the ground with no feet. And yes, I can move faster than a millipede because I'm much bigger than a millipede. But, is there any rhyme or reason? Is there any principle for what makes it so that, right? Because again, like the idea is perhaps to somebody with 1 foot looking at, somebody with like 1 million feet, like a millipede, says, wow, you have all those feet. I wish I had feet like that. And the millipede is like, no, it's kind of just the way things are. And the millipede says to the snake, well, look, I have 1 million feet. I do have none, but you can go faster than me. That's weird, because I thought that more feet meant move better or move faster. And the snake says, no, it's just the way I was designed. That's it. Yep, I move around like this. And then the snake says to the wind, right, I move along with my spine and ribs, and I have a definite shape when I'm doing it. But you, with your howling up to the North Sea and whipping down through the South Sea, seem to lack any sort of definite shape. What's up with that? So the idea is that, like, you need a shape to move. how can you move without a shape? That's kind of weird, right? How does the wind move? That's the question that's being asked here. And the wind says, indeed, I howl my way up to the North Sea and then whip my way down to the South Sea. Sure, but you could defeat me by extending your finger, right? So if you just put a finger in the way of the wind has to go around your finger, right? At least that's the idea. And if you tread on me, you may also defeat me, right? So if you just put down your foot and you've like smushed the air beneath your feet, in a sense, you've defeated at least a very small part of the wind. So that's what the wind is admitting here. Nevertheless, only I am the one who can snap great trees or blow over a great house. Thus, one may utilize a multitude of insignificant things which cannot overcome anything on their own to enact a great overcoming. And only the sage is able to enact the great overcoming. So that's like kind of cool. The idea that a bunch of little insignificant things can add up to something massive. And again, the emphasis is on perspective, right? Now that's where the dialogue stops there. It doesn't keep going. It doesn't say like the wind talks to the eye and the eye talks to the mind. Like we don't get that part. It just sort of stops after the snake talks to the wind. So yeah, there you go. So that's the wind and the millipede and the snake dialogue. Okay, 17.9. Kongzi was wandering in Kuang in the state of Wei when some men from Song surrounded him, and he continued to sing and play the lyre without stopping. Zilu, who's one of Confucius's disciples. Oh, by the way, Kongzi is Confucius. Sorry, I should have translated it as Confucius, but that's his Chinese name, often referred to as Kongzi, but it's Confucius. And he was wandering around. So this is another example of Confucius showing up in the Zhuangzi. And usually Confucius says things that are not very Confucian when he appears in the Zhuangzi. He's very often a spokesman for Daoist ideas, although sometimes he's a spokesman for Confucian ideas and he gets made fun of by other people. That happens in the Zhuangzi as well. In this case, he's got the right answer. He's the mouthpiece for the view, not the foil for the critique. So Confucius was wandering around in Kuang in the state of Wei when some men from Song surrounded him, and he continued to sing and play his lyre without stopping. Zilu, his disciple, entered the scene and said, "Master, what are you so happy about? Right? We're being surrounded by bandits. Like, why are you just singing?" And Confucius said, "Come here and I'll tell you. I avoided such dire straits for a long time, but I have not been spared. I have avoided such dire straits for a long time, but that I have not been spared must indeed be fate. I have traveled and sought a suitable ruler for a long time, but that I haven't found one must be a sign of the times." Right, so he's saying that, look, I've tried my best to, never get myself surrounded by bandits, and I've tried, I've been to many rulers, and I've tried to give advice to many rulers, and I never found one who would actually just like listen to me and do what I want. And this is like a common theme in Confucianism, that Confucius and a couple other early Confucians were like, they're championed as the proponents of righteousness and benevolent government and virtue and things like that. But during Confucius's lifetime, he didn't really have a super successful career as a government advisor or statesman. So the Zhuangzi frequently picks on Confucius for not being very successful, and this is like another example of that, right? Like, here he is in the middle of nowhere and he gets surrounded by bandits. Like, haha, point and laugh, right? And Confucius here is saying, well, it must be fate. Like, whatever. I don't know. I've tried, and the fact that I've failed, like, it's just got to be, it's a sign of the times. It's just, things just aren't coming up wins, right? I'm not ringing up any wins here. It is what it is. During the time of Yao and Shun, nobody in the empire was in dire straits, but it's not like they knew how to accomplish this, right? Yao and Shun being the ancient sages. Right. During the time of Jie and Zhou, there wasn't a single person with integrity in the empire, but it's not like they knew how to get rid of such people, The times are powerful, and what was suitable made it so. Those who work in the water don't avoid lizards or dragons. This is the courage of a fisherman. Those who work on the land don't avoid rhinos or tigers. That's the courage of the hunters. With bright and sharp blades before them, they look like death. They look at death like being reborn. This is the courage of a fierce soldier. When one understands that being in dire straits is a matter of fate, and that success is a matter of timeliness, when one comes across great difficulties but remains unafraid, this is the courage of a sage. Wait, yo. My fate has its determinations. Shortly thereafter, the leaders came and released them, saying, "We thought you were Yang Hu. That's why we surrounded you. But now we see that you're not, and we beg to take our leave." Right? So the bandits leave Confucius alone. Right? There's a happy ending. But previous to that, Confucius sort of like accepted his fate. He just said, "Look, things are all messed up. Things happen without any rhyme or reason. Things just happen because it's time for them to happen. The forces of the universe work in mysterious ways, and sometimes stuff just happens on a grand, I don't want to say cosmic, but on a large scale within the context of human life and human society, and you're not going to fight it, right? You're not going to fight it. If nobody's listening to me in warring states China, then my time just hasn't come yet. And funny enough, there was a time, right? His time did come, and it was a couple hundred years later, during the Han Dynasty, when Confucianism became the orthodoxy and has been, ever since, really. And that's the times, right? And there's no fighting that. So, and the idea is, well, you want to maintain your integrity and just accept that, yep, sometimes life is going to take you for a ride. Sometimes fate is just going to mess with you. Sometimes you're going to be in a situation where the cosmic forces that control basically everything are not going to end up the way that you preferred them to be. And that's all there is to it. So there you go. That's a nice little story there. Okay, this is a little longer dialogue, but it's pretty good. This is between Gongsunlong and Gongsunlong. We don't really know who Gongsunlong is, but he was just some guy from Wei. Wei is one of the states from ancient China, from the Warring States period. So Gongsunlong, the logician, the sophist, the philosopher guy, asked Gongsunlong of Wei as follows. "When I was young, I studied the way of the former kings, and as I grew up, I learned about benevolent and righteous conduct." Right, so he's saying, when I was young, I studied all the stuff that I was supposed to. I learned about the Tao, I learned about the way, and I learned about being benevolent and righteous. I learned how to be good. I united sameness and different and mixed together hard and white. So this idea of hard and white, this is another one of these logic property paradox tool things, right? Where if a rock can be hard and white, but if you smash the rock, then it's no longer hard because it's smashed into a bunch of little pieces, but it's still white, right? Because the whiteness persists throughout the entire rock, where the hardness can go away if you break the rock down enough, right? And things like that, right? The differences between different properties mean that you might want to treat the properties as being different, or they're different categories of properties, and whether or not a property is extended throughout the thing and things like that, right? So this was all stuff that Gongsunlong and the other logicians would have focused on. So he's saying, I did all that stuff. I deemed what was so and what was not so, what was acceptable and what was unacceptable, and I fully encapsulated the knowledge of the 100 schools, towering over the impoverished sophistry of the masses. I took myself to have reached the pinnacle, but now I have heard the words of Zhuangzi, and I have been cast into confusion. I don't know if my rhetorical skills doesn't match his, or if my understanding is lacking. I now find that I can scarcely open my mouth. So I dare ask you, what should I do? What direction should I pursue? Right, so here's Gongsunlong. He's like, look, I got all this stuff figured, I'm at the top. I'm at the peak, right? I figured out, I studied the way of the former kings, the Tao. I got a good grasp of the Tao. I know about being good. I know about benevolence and righteousness. I figured out all the logic stuff. I figured out a consistent way of determining what things are not, what things are acceptable, what things aren't. And I've just fully encapsulated the knowledge of the 100 schools, right? I've figured out all the wisdom of all the philosophers, and I'm the best. But then I started talking to Zhuangzi, and I don't know which way is up. Zhuangzi just totally blew my mind. What do I do? Right? What do I do? That's the question. Gongsunlong leaned forward on his armrest and let out a great sigh. He then looked up towards heaven and laughed, saying, "Have you not heard of the frog and the crumbling well? He once said to a turtle of the eastern sea, 'How joyous it is! I go out and hop along the edge of the well, and then I head inward to rest atop the broken bricks. In the water, I pump my legs to keep my chin afloat, and in the mud, I lose sight of my feet all the way past the ankles. I look back at the worms and crabs and tadpoles, but none can compare to me. To have complete dominion over the waters of this domain, to be unparalleled in enjoying the crumbling well, this is simply the utmost. Why don't you come in and see for yourself?'" So this is the frog speaking in the context of the answer by Gongsunlong to Gongsunlong, right? So the frog asked the turtle, "Why don't you come in? Like, everything is great. I'm just the best. My world is the best." Clearly the analogy is between the frog and Gongsunlong, who gave his description of here I am in charge of everything in my world. I've got it all figured out. But then I talked to Zhuangzi, and now I'm super confused. And Gongsunlong gives this analogy of the frog. He says, here's this frog who's got it all made. And he asked his friend the turtle to come and see his beautiful crumbling well that he has the domain over. But before the turtle of the eastern sea could even get his left foot into the well, his right leg had gotten stuck up to the knee. The turtle then hesitated and retreated, and he began to tell the frog about the sea, saying, "Of the sea, 1,000 li is not enough to describe its length, nor is 1,000 fathoms enough to describe its depth. In the time of Yao, there were floods in 9 years out of 10, and yet the water level did not increase. In the time of Tang, there were droughts 7 years out of 8, and yet the water level on the cliffs never receded. No transformation occurs in it on account of either short-term or long-term events, and no alteration in the coming and going of the tides occurs on account of either great or small events. This is indeed the great joy of the Eastern Sea." When the frog of the crumbling well heard this, he was horrified and dumbfounded, as if he lost himself. So there you go, right? The frog in the well, again, super happy in his little world. He's the king of the mountain, king of the castle. He's got complete dominion over the waters. He's unparalleled. And he tells his friend the turtle to come in, join, come see the place. And the turtle says, "Man, you have no idea." And he starts talking about the ocean, which is look, you can't even wrap your head around how big and how impressive this thing is, right? And the frog hears this and is just dumbfounded. He's like, "What are you talking about?" Right? And now Gongsunlong is back to just, there's no more nested speech. Now it's just about, he's gonna give Gongsunlong a lecture here. "And yet you, whose understanding doesn't comprehend the ends of Shi and Fei, nevertheless desire to comprehend the teachings of Zhuangzi. This is like a mosquito trying to carry a mountain on its back, or a millipede trying to keep up with the river. It'll certainly fail. You, whose understanding doesn't reflect the knowledge of how to discourse with or about the most extreme subtleties of the world, nevertheless find any occasion to demonstrate your sharpness. Is this not just like the case of the frog and the crumbling well? As for Zhuangzi, he treads on the yellow spring and mounts the great majesty of heaven itself without regard for south or north." The yellow spring is the underworld in Chinese folklore. "Utterly free and unfettered in all directions, he becomes lost in the immeasurable abyss. Beginning in the pool of mystery, he returns to the grand message. But all the while you look on, dumbfounded, and try to seek out an understanding of him through mere observation, groping at an understanding of him through disputation and sophistry. This is just like trying to view heaven through a tube, or to scan the earth with an awl. Are they not far too small to be up to the task? Get lost, good sir. Haven't you heard about... Okay, get lost, good sir. we'll stop there because the next section is worth talking about too. Right, so here he just sort of drives home the analogy between, Gongsunlong thinking he's so great and being confused about Zhuangzi to like, look, this guy Zhuangzi, he's on a level that like you can't even comprehend. Like you are the frog in the well in this story, my friend. Sorry, you're out of luck. Like you're way out of your element. Like you cannot keep up with Zhuangzi. Just like a frog cannot comprehend the ocean, right? It's just not. It's not going to happen. Sorry, you're like trying to look at the. I really like this example. You're trying to view the heavens through a tube. We do that. They're called telescopes. They're really helpful. But that's like, he's talking about like a literal, like just like this is a pen, but like a little tube, like trying to look at the sky through a tube. You get like a very small. Oh, sorry. You get like a very small perspective. That's not very helpful. Especially not with any magnification. Right, so Gongsunlong is kind of just, he's out of luck, right? Get lost, good sir. Haven't you heard about the son of Shouling studying the way to walk in Handan? So, like, yeah, we don't know who either of these people are, and we don't know where this place is, right? So this guy Shouling, like, we don't really know. He's just like some guy. The sources say he's from the state of Yan. Who really knows? Haven't you heard about the son of Shouling studying the way they walk in Handan, which is the name of a place? Before he mastered the ability to walk like they do in Handan, he forgot how he originally walked, and thus he had to crawl back home on his hands and knees. If you don't give up now, you'll lose sight of your old ways and be out of a job. Gongsunlong's mouth fell open and it would not close, and his tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth. He then ran off. So there you go. I like this example mostly because I have like a personal kind of experience with this, and you might too. If you've ever like learned how to do something one way and then been or attempted to, for whatever reason, attempted to change it to a different style of doing something, you end up in this weird position at some point where you can't really do either very well. So for me, like, it was typing, right? So most keyboards are QWERTY, right? QWERTY keyboards, right? But there's another keyboard layout called Dvorak, which is a bit more sensibly designed, arguably. Like all the vowels are on your home row, and like T and H are right next to each other, and it's supposed to like make you type faster. I believed this when I was in college, because somebody told me that, oh yeah, it's much faster. You can type much faster if you use Dvorak keyboard. Now I'm pretty sure all the research that supported that was like totally debunked. So I may have like learned this for like really no reason whatsoever. But regardless, at a certain point, when I was trying to unlearn how to type on a QWERTY keyboard and learn how to type on a Dvorak keyboard, there was one point where like the muscle memory was just incredibly confused because like I wasn't really good at typing on Dvorak yet. I still had to think really hard about where the keys were. But like I had also forgotten how to type effectively on QWERTY. So this story always reminded me of that. And maybe there's some other, maybe it reminds you of something where, a skill at playing an instrument or swimming or whatever. A lot of times we do things the way that are natural to us for a while, and then when we learn the correct way, the learning process can be very uncomfortable. There's this awkward middle stage where we haven't really mastered the new thing yet, but we've kind of like lost some of our sense of the old thing yet. We're kind of in this weird position. And in this case, it's about walking, right? So the guy forgot how to walk, but he didn't master the new way to walk, but he forgot his old way to walk, and so he had to crawl home. And our Gongzumo guy is saying, if you don't give up now trying to figure out Zhuangzi, who is just so far out of your league, you're going to like forget what you're good at and you're going to be out of a job. So just like stay in your lane, brother. Just stay in your lane. Don't even bother trying to deal with Zhuangzi, because you are just a little frog in a well and you're doing your thing, and it's very cute. It's very nice. It's good. Keep it up. Stay in your lane. Don't try and tango with Zhuangzi. You're going to lose. So there you go. Okay. This is a really famous story, right? So, well, before I move on, you can see how this would have been added to the autumn floods dialogue, because it's, the frog in the well, right? The frog in the well gets mentioned at the beginning in the original dialogue very briefly, and here we have like a longer story of the frog in the well. I don't know if it shows up anywhere else in the Zhuangzi. It might, but this idea of a frog in a well is sort of becomes a like a staple sort of aphorism in Chinese culture, and I think it's expanded a bit more elsewhere. I think people know. I guess. Well, I don't know when, or I'm not sure the extent to which it's known or popularized in Western-speaking places, English-speaking places. Okay. Here's another important story. Zhuangzi was fishing in the Pu River one day when the king of Chu sent 2 emissaries with the message that the king wished to task Zhuangzi with the control of all his territories. So Zhuangzi was fishing. Some guys show up. They were sent by the king of Chu. The king of Chu apparently wants to give Zhuangzi the kingdom. Say, look, here you go. You, Zhuangzi, you're so smart, you're so great, you're wonderful. Here, be king. Zhuangzi didn't even lay down his fishing rod and said, I have heard there is a divine tortoise in the state of Chu that has been dead for some 3,000 years, and the king keeps it stored in a basket covered in cloth in the ancestral temple. Now as for this tortoise, do you think it prefers to be dead, but have left behind its shell to be prized, or would it prefer instead to live on and drag its tail in the mud? And the 2 guys say, surely it would prefer to live on and drag its tail in the mud. So then Zhuangzi says, begone, I'm going to drag my tail in the mud. Right. So there you go. So this is a rejection of political office because it'll get in the way of Zhuangzi's preferred way of life, which is, kind of probably, we don't know, but living like this, right? Going along with the transformations of things and not trying to be influenced or swayed by conventional valuations of things, and not being influenced by the prospect of power or money or whatever, right? So there you go. It's about abdicating or rejection of rulership, and this is a theme that gets repeated in the Zhuangzi. This idea of rejecting political office, rejecting the chance for political office because it gets in the way of one's own flourishing as an individual, right? So politics is toxic, basically. Okay, 2 more. Huizi was a minister in Liang, and Zhuangzi went to see him. So Huizi is actually Zhuangzi's friend. There's lots of stories in the Zhuangzi of Zhuangzi and Huizi talking to each other, like the next one, Zhuangzi and Huizi. And in this case, it's just another one, right? But Huizi was also a logician who is famously associated with some different paradoxes in logic that Zhuangzi would have. Well, it seems like an uneven friendship, but there's also this very beautiful moment where Zhuangzi says, Zhuangzi clearly cares about Huizi throughout the Zhuangzi and all the different stories that we see. And so the pair of Zhuangzi and Huizi being together in stories is a common reoccurrence throughout the text. So Huizi was a minister in Liang, and Zhuangzi went to see him. And somebody asked Huizi, or somebody said to Huizi, if Zhuangzi is coming, it must be because he wants your job. And Huizi was terrified, so for 3 days and 3 nights he searched all over the state for Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi eventually went to see him and said, in the south, there is a fenghuang bird called yuanchu. Do you know of it? Yuanchu emerges from the South Sea and flies to the North Sea, only stopping to rest in the sycamore tree, only eating the fruit of the lian tree, and only drinking the purest spring water. Once it flew over an owl that had caught a decaying rat. The owl looked up towards the yuanchu and let out a shriek. Now, do you similarly wish to frighten me with a shriek to prevent me from taking control of Liang? So there you go. That's the story. It's very similar to the previous one, right? It's about abdication. It's about not taking political office. So Huizi was a minister, and Zhuangzi is coming to visit him, and somebody says, "Oh, Zhuangzi must want your job because Zhuangzi had a good reputation, I guess, and if he's coming to see you, it must be because he's after your position." And Huizi got very nervous because he doesn't want to lose his position, and Zhuangzi basically says, like, why would I want to do that, right? Why would I want to do that? Look, I am the Feng Huang, I am the phoenix, I am this bird, right? And this bird, I get to do whatever I want. I have this awesome life. I only drink from the finest springs. I rest whenever I want. And here, you are like the owl chewing on a rotten rat and trying to protect it from me. But why would I have any interest in controlling or in having political office? It just seems like a disaster. Why would I want that? So that's the idea. Again, it's about like rejecting rulership. And now we get to the final and one of the most popular stories in the Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi and Huizi were strolling over the Hao River. Zhuangzi said, "The fish come out and wander about, unbothered by anything. This is the joy of fish." And Huizi says, "You are not a fish. How do you know of the fish's happiness?" Well, I guess I could keep that consistent, right? I should translate the joy as happiness, right? But it's the same word in Chinese. Le. Right? Zhuangzi said, "You are not me. How do you know that I don't know the fish's happiness?" And Huizi said, "Well, I am not you, so surely I don't know you. But surely you are not a fish. Thus, you don't know the complete happiness of the fish." And Zhuangzi said, "Well, let's return to the foundation. You asked how I know of the fish's happiness. Thus, you already acknowledge that I know it, and yet you ask me anyway. In that case, I know it from being above the Hao River." Or another way, I know it from the perspective of being over the river. That's my perspective. That's where I'm looking down on it. Yeah. Okay. Lots of different ways people interpret this. People read a lot into this story. Personally, I think it's very vague. I think you could say a lot about it. There's whole books written on it. I don't know. You can make up your own mind. I don't make much of it. I mean, I think it's about perspective, right? Whether or not there's like some really deep paradoxical thing going on here, I'm not like super convinced or super sure. The idea is like, well, you're not a fish. How do you know the fish are happy? And Zhuangzi sort of says, like, "Ooh, well, you're not me. How do you know I don't know the fish are happy?" And Huizi is like, "Well, yeah, but like, there's limits to how much you know the happiness of fish because you're not a fish, right? Like, just like, I don't know you. There's limits to how much I know about you." And then Zhuangzi's response here is like, it's a bit unclear what's being said. Again, like, it's how we interpret this last line, right? I know it from being above the Hao River. Like, I take that as a point about perspective, and a lot of it hinges on how we understand this word "how," which is "an," which is like a somewhat uncommon question word that can mean like how or where, or in what way or from what perspective, right? So there's different ways we can interpret the question word here. So I get my reading that, well, I know it from my perspective. That's the only perspective I know it from because that's the only one I can occupy. And my perspective is, so basically, like, we are always stuck in a limited perspective, right? And there's only so much we can do. So all I know, I can base on what I see from my perspective. That's as good as I can do. That's how I know it. I know that the fish are happy because I'm standing over the river and I'm looking at them doing their thing and I deem them happy for it. And that's as good as I can do. That's really the best I can hope for, right? No, I'm not a fish, obviously. And yet, I know things, right? I know that they're happy. And you acknowledge that I know that they're happy because you said, how do you know that they're happy? So, haha. Something like that. That's not super satisfying, but again, I think it's about perspective and the sort of, again, going with the theme of the autumn floods dialogue is that our perspective is necessarily limited. There's just limits to what we can expect to know, and what can serve as the basis for our judgments can only ever be within our perspective. We can't step outside of ourselves and go figure out if fish are actually happy by being a fish temporarily. Like, we can't do that. All we have is our perspective at any given moment, and that's the basis for our judgments. Okay, that's it. There you go. That was Autumn Floods from the Zhuangzi, our first video in Chinese philosophy. That was only 2 hours. Wow, cool. Only a 2-hour video. Not bad. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you enjoyed our first exploration of Chinese philosophy. More on the way. Like I said, I got 2 more that I'd like to do that are kind of like self-contained units. That's the thing that's tricky about Chinese philosophy, is that because of the nature of the texts, it's tricky to pick stuff that is self-contained enough, but long enough for a video, right? Like, I couldn't just do, the happy fish story. I mean, I could talk for an hour on the happy fish story, right? But like, that's not really the spirit of what we're doing here. I want something I can like read through and we can like go through kind of slowly. So this is like episodic and enough that it makes sense to do that. But I got more stuff like that coming. So I hope you enjoyed. And if you did, remember to leave a like. That'd be great. And I will see you in the next video. Take care.